Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Really happy you're here. My name is Annin Barrett, and I teach in the Textile Arts curriculum at Portland State University. For those of you joining us from outside the university, the Textile Arts curriculum is an elective track in the BFA Art Practice program, and it provides an interdisciplinary approach to the study of clothing and textiles. We offer courses in weaving, surface design, sewn construction, and dress history that encourages students to develop portfolios for a variety of applications in fashion, costume, textiles, and contemporary art. This is one of several events we are hosting this term that invite students and the public to engage with outside perspectives that supplement our current course offerings. Today, you're in for a treat as we welcome Jeanne Medina into our History of Dress course. Please feel free to visit our website, which I'll post in the chat in a minute, and find out about our upcoming programming. They're all free lectures. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge we are joining you all from Portland State University, which is located in the heart of downtown Portland, Oregon, in Multnomah County. We honor the Indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand on: the Multnomah, Kathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala, bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other Indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. Now I'd like to introduce Jeanne. Jeanne Medina engages the processes of weaving as a relational and collaborative practice. She is interested in the rhythms and encounters embodied in textile that resonate in the broader ecology of the human and non-human. Her projects explore the entanglements of her lived experience, often trying to decolonize the fixed and fluid spaces of her filipina-american identity. Guided by an aesthetics of the earth, she uses garment, installation, and performance to create full sensory experiences, engaging her site and audience as collaborators. Jeanne is the fiber program area head and assistant professor at California State University at Long Beach, and I'm so delighted you're here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me, Annin. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
And I'd just like to add that if you have any questions, please post them in the chat and we'll get to them after Jeanne's talk.
Thank you. So thank you, Annin, and thank you, Allison, for inviting me here today. And thank you to everyone for joining today to hear me talk about my work. It's a really great honor to be able to present to you today. So I'd like to just, before we get started, kind of give you a little bit of a warning that this isn't a really tidy presentation. I don't move chronologically or procedurally through ideas, but rather it's an emergence of projects in relation to ideas and encounters. I used to use this diagram as a good way of describing my process, which traveled along kind of an XY axis, textile, performance, garment installation. And the deeper I go into my practice, the more I realize it looks something a little bit more like, oops, like this. And so, you know, it's a little bit messier, right? It has a little bit more dimension. Each of these layers would be a project or a kind of wonder zone, and the holes are the ideas or treasure chambers, while the threads and dotted lines are the connections that flow through the projects. And still, I feel like this one might even capture the process a little bit better. Here's a diagram of a feedback spiral. It seems to capture the thought process even more closely, an entanglement that is continuous and doubles back onto itself. And so both of these diagrams are from Cyclonopedia by Reza Nagaristani. And so the work really, I see it as an embodiment of a relational process that emerges through sensing and feeling. What I hope you see in the work itself is that it's emerging out of my surround, and that some of it will sound really abstract, but that's okay. What's more important is that if it moves you, you'll travel with it. I'm currently following a process philosophy course with Dr. Jeanne Medina at Concordia University in Montreal. And we're studying what Edward Glissant calls the opaque in his book, A Poetics of Relation. Annin opens the course by stating that the opaque is the relational, the poetics that insist that there be a consent not to be a single being. What is it to make sense in this poetics of feeling? Feeling in process philosophy is not subjective. It is not what a subject does. Feeling is what propels the subjectivity into act. To have a world motored by feeling is arguably to displace the transparency of the colonial project, to shift the contours of what has been made to count. So when I say that my making process is one of embodiment, the body and the materials organize themselves through technique. But when I look back at my work and when I really look at it, I find that it's showing me all the questions that I need to ask of the world. Like, what are we doing to the earth? And how do we tend to the horror of our environment? How has being human served us? And how are we supporting an ecology which emancipates and empowers a relation of encounters with each other and the world? To imagine the transparency of relation is to also to justify the opacity of what impels it. The sacred is of us, of this network, of our wandering, our errantry. This is a quote from Edward Glissant in The Poetics of Relation. And so one of my greatest assets is my material somatic knowledge, knowing with my hands, my skin, and my senses. I try to learn the space of the body, both physical and psychological, through textile production, garment manipulation, and performance. The culmination of these experiences enables me to develop models of operation, processes, and build a network of resources in order to realize larger projects and collaborations. At this capacity, my role as an artist is to construct a different kind of fabric, one of ideas and people. I become the thread, mediator, connector, facilitator. I can only know the space of cloth through my haptic experience. Excuse me. Through habitation of a garment, I understand it as true interior space, a void that when occupied becomes a third kind of space, that of the other. This is where interiority meets exteriority. In my work Body Object Studies, I use dance to activate the internal space of the garment. The concrete geometry of the circular garment collapsed when introduced to my body. It became an animated other in response to its movement. Discovering the interior, in effect, reshapes the exterior body space horizon line, the visible, the outward worlding. The space of the silhouette is the third space of the body, the index, the shadow space, the void. In Felt Fractal, I document my experience of navigating the space of a textile to imagine myself as a thread moving through the shed of a warp, or what it feels like to be entangled in a knot. From this, I can imagine the space around the body in which to build and occupy. Through mediation, I wanted to turn the video itself into another kind of textile, one that was constantly unfolding and fracturing. It's a proposal for a more open and virtual vision of a bodily state, one that is multiplicitous and already always shifting. At another phase of my work, I manipulate garments to construct I manipulate patterns to construct garments for the body. In the flat deformed studies based on Buckminster Fuller's architectural triangulation, I used equilateral triangles to construct garments that followed a structure of logic independent of the body, but for the body. The process allowed for the accordion-like compression of fabric, which when expanded, created structural versatility and possibility for an ever-changing silhouette. It raised the questions: what are the possibilities for its occupation? Must a garment's utility have a determinate life, or can it serve many functions, such as garment, shelter, or aesthetic object? The garments request a connection with the subject to explore them, to know them, and to constantly look for multiple ways of inhabiting them. Errantry. That is very much the image of the rhizome, prompting the knowledge that identity is no longer completely in the root, but also in relation. Because the thought of errantry is also the thought of what is relative, the thing relayed as well as the thing related. The thought of errantry is a poetic, which at some moment always infers that it is told. The tale of errantry is the tale of relation. Dr. Jana Cephas's research on the urbanization of Detroit in the early 20th century had a major influence in bringing my awareness to my body in relation to craft production, especially in the city of lost industry and Black community. She was particularly interested in examining the metaphors associated with working class bodies, modern buildings, and efficient machines. As the capital of the post-industrial world, Detroit became well known for its vacancy and urban ruins. This is an image from the demolition of Detroit City Hall in 1961. It was one of many significant demolitions which factored into local discourses concerning the city's declining population, lost industry, and dilapidated architecture. Jana read the demolition sites to study what might be found in the place of architectural absence, namely the absent presence of histories and social memories past that in turn are integral to city making. On March 10th, 2013, during the Daylight Savings performance, I attempted to address sight as material. I sought to actively engage my audience in their encounter of the work and to open a dialogue with place. I invited collaboration with Wayne State University dancers, videographer John Mui, and music collaborator Maya Sems to realize the project. I see place not as a geographical condition, but as an occurrence between human and non-human. I needed to clear out a space for the viewer, physical and psychological, to encounter the performance. The audience was engaged as participants, collaborators, and were led down a 1-mile walk down a greenway along a repurposed corridor called the DeQuinder Cut. Working with the dancers, we created movement phrases derived from the weaving process. The Global Trading Company, a derelict building at the international border between Michigan and Canada, was encountered at the end of the cut. The site became the warp with which the dancers engaged as the weft. The garments, like the site, became the framework for physical and emotional entanglement. Oops. Sorry, I just want to make sure that everybody could hear the sound, and I inadvertently stopped the video. Annin, can you hear the sound?
No, it's not playing sound.
It's not playing sound. Okay, I apologize for that. let me please do a really quick tech check on that.
That little box on the share screen to optimize for video sound, maybe?
I am so sorry. Let me try this. Okay, let's go back here. I apologize for that.
No problem.
How about now?
Not so far. Yeah.
You hear it now?
No. It's very muffled, very quiet. So is the little box in the lower left-hand corner checked in the share screen window? This is giving people a chance to enter their questions so far in the chat, so not bad.
Okay, let's just do one quick thing here.
Hi, Jean, do you want to stop sharing? And then,
Yes, thank
then,
you.
yeah, and then click share screen. Do not choose the PowerPoint yet, and on the left bottom, you will see a box called that you can click for sound and video. Did you see that?
Oh, yes, thank you. Let's see.
And then select your PowerPoint.
Thank you so much, Min.
You're welcome.
And now it seems that we're loading. Okay. Can you hear it now?
Still pretty muted, so let's just, yeah, I don't know what else we can try.
Okay, sorry about that. We'll just let it run.
Yeah.
So here, this is the site at the Global Trading Company at the end of the DeQuinder Cut in Detroit. And strangely, it's one of the only places where the US border is, the US is sort of like north of the Canadian border, and across the border is Windsor, Canada. And at the same time, it was also daylight savings. And so I felt like this was sort of a moment to kind of collaborate with the place and its sort of like upside downness. And it was also in an area that was being gentrified in the moment. And so it felt fraught with a lot of tension. And so it seemed like an interesting site to kind of situate this performative work. We were also, trying to unfold like how to collaborate with many different people. And so choreographer Biba Bell, introduced me to some of her students at Wayne State University, and we're thinking about the process of weaving and thinking about entanglement and the site, and ended up coming together in this piece. We also wrote to Laurie Anderson, who wrote the sound piece Walking and Falling, which unfortunately you couldn't hear. And she agreed to let us use the piece for the performance. So in some ways we also like to think that we're collaborating with Laurie Anderson on that project. While teaching at OCAC, I taught the graduate seminar with Carl Berkheimer on the topic of the provisional. And in January 2019, we led the students on a trip to Wendover, a city that sits on the border of Nevada and Utah. And it's a site that is a now abandoned military airstrip. This city also sits at the edge of the Bonneville Salt Flats. It's 26,000 acres of salt flats where land speed records are measured and made, and is also where the crew of the Enola Gay trained before dropping the atom bomb on Japan in 1945. Nearby are several site-specific landwork arts, including the Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson and Sun Tunnels by Nancy Holt. And so the Great Salt Lake, which is on the eastern border of this great stretch of salty space, is at its lowest point it's ever been. According to NPR, one of the biggest worries is that the Great Salt Lake will go the way that others have gone before it, not just drying up and ceasing to be a source of water, but becoming a source of poison. Biologist Bonnie Baxter says that more than 40% of the lake bed is no longer covered by water and could turn to dust. And so in visiting these two earthworks, I was thinking about the idea of provisionality, and not in the sense of provisional painting, which specifically addresses the non-essential nature and skill and craft of within painting, and nor in like a kind of casualist sense in which painting might appear unfinished or incomplete, but more in the like literal adjective sense of being arranged or existing for the present and possibly to be changed later. So because the earth changes and is indeed changing, Smithson practiced an explicit complicity with geological time, the provisional nature of working with material. Nancy Holt's Sun Tunnels is truly in the middle of vast space, a perfect horizon where you are surrounded by earth and sky. As one moves through the concrete pipes, the gaze is directed to look at the landscape, but also the cosmos. I was thinking about framing and contextualizing and pointing toward, and how a work can point outwardly into the imperceptible and ineffable. When the only context is the vastness of the earth, it is easy to observe that perception itself is praxis. Opening to the poetic relation between the human and non-human is a skill or practice that is already moving and worlding and languaging in the surround. So I'm really thinking about, looking as an act of embracing the unknowable and also surrendering and being porous to it. As an artist, I'm becoming more entangled and my practice complicated by a complicity with the earth and a necessary politicization. As artists considering processes such as the geologic that are bigger than any cultural practice, we become aware that we are already in a poetics of relation. We consent not to be a single being. Engaging in this kind of relational, porous, and rhizomatic practice enables new ways of being which can only exist outside the construct of colonial whiteness. It's an emancipation of the individual into an emergent sociality, a relation uncountable and a more than the sum of its parts. If we tune into relation in all its senses, telling, listening, connecting, and the parallel consciousness to self and the surroundings, we open ourselves to an immense opportunity, not only to our work as artists and thinkers, but for facilitating an ecology of encounter, to shift perspectives and reimagine new ways of being. Recent research regarding the significance and consequence of anthropogenic changes in the Earth's land, ocean, biosphere, and climate have demonstrated that, from a wide range of scientific research positions, it is probable to conclude that humans have entered a new geological epoch, their own. This is from Art in the Anthropocene. And so in this workshop titled Art in the Anthropocene with Dr. A.T.M. Turpin, we were trying to sort of like envision and conceive what the Anthropocene is. And so it's difficult to imagine, right? Because its concept creates a distortion of human scale, a decentralization. It's perceiving geologic time. It's a structural blindness in which we can't access part of our own reality because the process exceeds our human capacity to witness it. This is a drawing by Jimmy Durham from the second particle wave theory in 2005 that was used by Etienne Turpin to illustrate the idea of structural blindness, right? So there's this mass, right, that's sort of like hovering overhead, and we're like, let's just hope that this is a cloud and not a meteor. And meanwhile, it's something, much larger than we can imagine. In How Societies Remember, Paul Connerton describes two kinds of bodily practices in which memory is sedimented or amassed in the body. One is an incorporating practice, messages or transmissions imparted by means of bodily activity in presence of each other, a smile, a handshake, or words spoken in the presence of someone. The transmission occurs only during the time that their bodies are present to sustain that particular activity. The other is an inscribing practice. This includes all of our modern devices for storing and retrieving information: computers, print, indexes, photos, sound recordings, all require that we do something that traps and holds information long after the human organism has stopped informing. In the Project S was a collaboration with Jovencio de la Paz, Chase Henson, Sarah Huerta, and Katie Wood. We set a 12-foot by 12-foot stage of salt. The letter S represented the salt, but also the mathematical symbol for the thermodynamic law of entropy. A soundtrack of static played off of an old weather radio worn as a mask. I made the garments and stood in attendance at the border of the salt canvas. The participants performed a series of movements based on actions of incorporating and inscribing. The performance came to a conclusion as the salt was swept away. In Convergent Dimensions, I was trying to make with short-term memory, collaborating with forgetting. In essence, instead of centralizing my practice in one site, I wanted to erase the context to make room to describe my own territory. This process of entropy, reducing the world, limiting, focusing, letting even the materials forget themselves, eventually allowed me to reintroduce the context, that of the performance space. My ASMs created a playlist of music based on her interpretation of my work. While in the studio, I worked to the playlist over and over, eventually translating the music into the weavings through codified blocks of materials and sensations. I invited producer Aaron Fitzsiegel to remix the playlist into a soundscape, to which choreographer Biba Bell developed movement phrases based on the process of weaving. The performance played with the audience's perception of when the performance began and when it might end, while the garments hung in unison at the installation site. The dancers were flocking across the campus towards the site where they would activate the work. In the end, the performance became a tapestry of all the participants and their sum of contributions to the total work of art. But we need to figure out whether or not there are other succulencies of relation in other parts of the world and already at work in an underground manner that will suddenly open up other avenues and soon help to correct whatever simplifying ethnocentric exclusions may have arisen from such a perspective. Exactly a year before visiting Wendover, I visited Guatemala to work with Pishan, a Mayan group of weavers. In traveling through this resource-rich region of the world where Spanish colonization subjugated the indigenous Mayan communities, I came to see my own relationship to the violence of colonialism. My ancestors are from the Philippines, which is a country that is also colonized by Portugal and Spain and later occupied by the US. And I was standing at the top of a volcano at the edge of Lake Atitlan when I felt this kind of energy sort of waking me up, and I really had this moment of clarity. And I thought, is this sort of like the present me kind of acknowledging the future me, or the past me leaving the present me to make room for the future me? And it's this sense that I that didn't quite understand at the time, but now I kind of realize that, that that was me now talking about my work then as a part of my creative process. So the Highland Support Project supports Pichon, a fair trade textile workshop in the Western Highlands of Guatemala. Pichon, meaning spirit in the Mayan language of Quiche, is an association of indigenous artisan weavers, expert in the ancient techniques of backstrap and petal loom weaving and embroidery. I was tasked with helping develop new designs with locally available materials and nascent technique that could diversify their portfolio of production and hopefully attract more work and economic stimulation. We sourced materials locally and visited the homes of skilled weavers, dyers, and knitters to learn about their capabilities. While I was there, I witnessed an entire village of people come to the community center where we were working to express their gratitude to the organizers and share their stories. Together, we created 9 rug designs, 12 fabrics, and 10 garments we developed over the course of 2 weeks. We also invited Paula Sepp, the head weaver of Pichon, to visit Virginia Commonwealth University and exchange knowledge about the commonalities and differences between our cultural textile practices. We learned how backstrap looms were used to produce po, pattern cloth used to make huipil and other garments, which reflect Mayan environment and cosmological symbolism. The work for ancestral offerings emerged amidst these encounters. The textiles tell the stories of my paternal grandmother and how her mother gave her away, how she in turn gave my father away, and then how these mothers returned and turned away again. The first is a series of 4 double ikat indigo dyed linen pieces collaged with hemp and sisal, linen, and cotton. On the left is she came and then she left, and on the right is nearby is a waterfall from where we can jump into the water. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. These pieces incorporate raya knots, which have a surface which look like they're weeping. The one on the left is I could hear her outside crying, and on the right, tears and vespers for Petra Canieta. Excuse me. There were also a series of garments that were parts of other ongoing collaborations that hung with the textiles so they wouldn't get lonely or forget that they weren't without relation. Here's some more images of garments. And then these pieces were woven by Pichon and are titled Complicit Forms. The images are graphic topologies of garments translated through the technique and hands of the weavers, like non-lingual stories passed through gesture and touch. The borders of the frames were formed using an epoxy clay, which is an oil-based product that dries into stone. There were also 2 sculptures, one made of rayon raffia knots that would welcome you at the end of the space and bid you farewell as you left. And then this hat, which sat on a giant table and which held the middle of the space like an altar and was a collaboration with Ignatius Hats, a milliner in Petersburg, Virginia. The interpretive commons for embodied textiles is a non-conceptual, imaginary entity. It enables me to contextualize my material-based work in adjacency to the institution. During a residency at the Oak Springs Garden Foundation in Upperville, Virginia, I was looking for an encounter with a kind of archive of absence. The foundation was set up by Rachel Bunny Mellon, a lifelong gardener and the wife of former Secretary of Treasury Andrew Mellon. But also she was the heiress to Listerine. She wore custom clothing by Balenciaga, and after he passed, became a patron of his protege, Givenchy. As a dear friend of Jacqueline Kennedy, she was invited to design the Rose Garden at the White House. The crown of the estate is Bunny's library, which houses her collection of original, rare, hand-illuminated botanical books, the kind commissioned by monarchs as a demonstration of the reach of their colonial rule. The estate is absolutely sprawling and is demarked by the signature melon low stone walls along the roads that border the property. And as I moved about the property, I couldn't help but feel all of the bodies who worked on this land to make this world possible for the melons. And it made me think about the land itself too, and Bunny engaged in an endless taming of the wild earth. And so at the residency, I really, really wanted to engage with the archive of botanical books, but I also just couldn't help but see, the kind of like invisible labor everywhere. And so I really wanted to make work about it and sort of, make visible the invisible. And so I ended up meeting this painter named Alvin who worked in the maintenance shops. And he pointed out to me that he was wearing all white because he was a painter and not a milkman. And we talked about art and how being a skilled painter was also art. And I asked him if I could collect some of the broken glass from a bucket in the shop. And he helped me break it into smaller pieces and told me I should present it on top of a bed of sand. And so all of these materials were salvaged from the properties, pieces of rock or metal that I found on the ground, and pieces that told the story of the place. And in the end, I wanted to offer, as a gesture of abstract labor, back as an acknowledgement that they had been seen. My solo exhibition at the Alice in Seattle was curated by Julia Hynexius. This piece is titled Prayers for Estella Crudo. It's a tapestry woven textile made of torn muslin strips and thousands of knotted ends of synthetic rayon raffia on a linen warp. It hangs off the wall from steel armature. Shown alongside the video of Becoming Prayers is a performance of moving into it, in it, and then out of it. Unnamed and unspoken is a hand-woven, hand-knotted textile in synthetic rayon raffia on resist-dyed linen warp, cotton muslin weft. The mylar grid on the far wall is titled Diagrammatic Portal Towards Embodied Knowledge in collaboration with Julia Hynexius. It's a site-specific woven mylar grid, 8 foot by 7 foot. This is a circular garment titled Nothing in No Place. It's hand-woven, double weave construction, circular shaped garment in cotton wool, rayon, linen, burnt wood, and blackened steel. Unassembled in pieces, hand-woven, hand-knotted textile in synthetic rayon raffia on warp-resisted dyed linen, cotton muslin weft, cement, steel, epoxy clay, cotton muslin sandbag. The merging zero of oneness, burnt wood, and blackened steel. And so Tomorrow Asteroid is the last project that I'll talk about, and it's a collaboration with my husband, Lap Lay. Lap is a graphic designer and writer, and together we want to create a platform for collaboration to reach a broader audience. It's a way for us to collaborate and be productive outside of our individual conceptual concerns. Our first project is a small collection of garments that we sold at the Family Goods event, coordinated by Lap's sister, Dan Lay. Dan is an art director for Network, which is an influencer platform. These are some images from some of the first samples. Dan produced and styled the shoot, Brittany Jones modeled, and Rob Liggins photographed. And this is a close-up of a caftan robe that was rust printed and dyed in black tea with an iron modifier. It was dyed at Pine Meadow Ranch in Sisters, Oregon, and was just in a show at Pendleton Art Center in Pendleton. The patterns for these garments were made while I was at Oregon College of Art and Craft, and slowly developed in Los Angeles after I gave birth to my son, Ito. And these pants were also made at Pine Meadow Ranch and Sisters, and the black and white print was hand printed at Oregon College of Art and Craft. And this print was a scan of one of my hand woven textiles, then hand screen printed onto muslin. And the same process was used for this one. And here is, this was our setup from the Family Goods event. We had another one in December, and there's another one upcoming in June. So if you're in LA, you should come by and say hi. And thank you very much.
Yes.
I would love to answer any questions you might have.
You've been getting lots of love in the chat, Jeanne.
Oh,
And yes,
I'm
your
gonna
work is
stop
so
sharing.
deeply, it's so deeply felt. It is inspiring and challenging and on so many levels.
Thank you. I have to say that I was really just surprised myself to get so emotional during the presentation. I don't think that's ever happened to me before, but yeah.
You're amongst, we all were getting teary. It touches so deeply. So thank you for sharing that. I have many questions here. So let's get started if you're willing. All right. Todd just asked, I love the idea of being connected to the earth and its surroundings. How do you feel about the use of synthetics instead of natural fibers?
That's such a good question. So I was just I always talk about natural fibers versus synthetic fibers to my students, and we always come up with sort of the exceptions of like how rayon and silk sort of like behave like one thing but also act like another thing. And rayon, even though it's a synthetic man-made material, it still comes from a byproduct of the paper making process, right? And so it acts like a cellulose. And so I don't, there's some synthetics where I'm like, yes, we should be using these and playing with these and, trying to also find like, really sustainable sort of material possibilities. But then I also think about how, petroleum-based products sort of like have this sort of agency of their own where they kind of just want to become oil again and they eventually just become sticky and start to deteriorate. And so I love the idea of thinking about synthetic materials as within a framework of like an aesthetic of the earth as well. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. Let's take another question. Here's from Tanner. And I'm going to edit this a little bit. Tanner is curious. Do you remember a time in your career where your involvement with the artwork you compose now originated from? Did your time as an artist begin with textiles and fold into studying the body in installments? Or did you start from recognizing deconstructing colonialism through the mediums present in your artwork?
Wow, what a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very astute perception of the work, because indeed, my connection to textile and my decision to use it comes from a deep connection that I think is, even came before me, right? Somehow it's so deeply rooted in my experience from birth, in fact, but also through childhood. My grandfather used to make us clothing, and so I would see him sewing all the time and would sort of be just like pillaging through his scraps constantly. And also like, thinking about like my bodily and physical experience and like sort of like always struggling to kind of find like clothing that fit and feeling like enormous frustration around like not being able to find things that were, that my body was appropriate for, right? Like thinking of it not as like being able to find something that fit me, but that I didn't fit it. And so, these are sort of things that sort of shaped my process and my search for answers. And indeed, like, I didn't embrace sort of making that, I didn't embrace truly that I was making identity-based work until I moved to Richmond, Virginia. And which is, has his historically the capital of the Confederacy, and has a, you know, a deeply embedded history of race and sort of cultural kind of segregation, and finding myself as a brown person in a place where the conversation was historically kind of black or white really made me feel like there wasn't a conversation for me. And so that's when I really started thinking about how important it was to be really explicit about searching my own identity and really trying to carve out space for it. And so that's kind of how I really started to step into thinking about my work as identity-based.
Thank you. I'm selecting questions in the chat that touch on subjects that maybe haven't already been addressed. So here's one from Ray. Ray says, I love this idea of inhabiting the other in your work. Can you share your entry point to this concept and how your understanding has evolved through your work with it?
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I think that like definitely goes back to what I was just saying about like trying to find spaces for myself, my, you know, social spaces that I fit, but also physically fitting into like garment spaces or, you know, sort of like habitable spaces. So, yeah, so it's like, you know, I can never say that I sort of directly approach my work, sort of exploring a very specific idea. You know, the ideas tend to emerge out of the making, but they're always sort of, or even like, the concepts that I'm thinking about emerge out of the work too. So it's sort of like happening both at the same time. But yeah, like I definitely don't have like a design process where, you know, I sort of like imagine the end goal and then sort of like execute it. I really, the idea and the work sort of emerges out of the process itself.
Cool. Here's a question maybe a little more interpretive. Let's see. This is from Rose, who was struck by your piece, Prestige Hat, constructed by Ignatius, 2018. And her comment is, this form of hat reminds her of the straw boater hat that was particularly fashionable with white colonizers, especially, but not exclusively, in hot and tropical climates around the early 1900s. With this in mind, I read this piece as a form of reappropriation. Is this piece meant to spark conversation about power, status, and the reappropriation of cultural identity through clothing? Or is she simply projecting colonial forms onto this work?
Wow, so that is such a great read of this piece. I think you just like hit it on the head. So this piece was developed during while I was working with a choreographer named Nija Whitson for their project called Oba Queen, Baba Queen Oba. And this piece was set in a dance, like sort of a dance hall where there was an upper tier of where sort of like the Black audience had to sit, and they would always have to look down onto the performance. And I think it was even a former church space. And so the performance then happened on the ground, and then the audience was sitting above and looking down onto the performance. And so the hat was really made sort of, you know, thinking about sort of like the visual where the audience would be viewing it from, and also thinking about this kind of like a visual hierarchy. But yes, indeed, the Ignatius, who recently passed away, was a Southern milliner based out of Petersburg, Virginia, and he actually lived in the home where I think it was General MacArthur and Abraham Lincoln sat on the porch and talked about sort of ending the Civil War. So he was deeply steeped in Southern history. And so that was definitely embedded into the sort of voter structure and the straw hat sort of techniques. And then some of the imagery was pulled from sort of more Yoruban design motifs, which were a major part of the work in Oba Queen Baba.
Wow, interesting references. Yes. Cool. There's a couple questions here about your video work.
Sure.
And Rev says, I love how you, Reverie says, I love how you experiment with the definition of textile and bring it into the fourth dimension. And similarly, your experimentation with garments in relation to the body resonates with them. Can you recall when and why you started to feel compelled to question the body and the human experience?
So I definitely think I started thinking about this in my undergraduate time, thinking about like the spiritual was sort of the concept course that I was in at the time, and thinking about what is the difference between the kind of like the spirit versus the body, and like never really quite being able to like resolve that question. And so like, you know, I think that the decision to work temporally or ephemerally is a way of also still kind of addressing the kind of like shifting nature of the body and the identity and the object, truly too, that an object is not just an object, and like a person, you can't see all of its facets in one moment, that you have to sort of be able to experience over time, and sort of for it to fully start to like reveal all of its aspects and to begin to understand it.
Oh, that's so true. And maybe that also answers Sky's question about your use of video. But yes, and isn't it always, textiles are such a process too, right? It takes a while to manifest anything. Yeah.
It takes a long while to manifest everything.
Yes, right. Reverie commented about your answer. That is, I deeply appreciate the artistic reaction expression to historic events, transmuting loss into gain.
Mm.
And isn't that, yeah, that idea of dross to gold, so ancient from spinner's tales, right?
Yeah, thinking about the absence of anything being an opportunity to manifest something new, for sure.
We're getting towards the top of the hour, so I think it might be time. I don't know if you need to go or if you have time for one more question.
We can take one more.
Right, let's see what hasn't been addressed yet here. Yeah. Would you want to say more about your concept of humaning, the broader ecology of humaning? That's the quote from your website. Paige asks, how did you come to this conceptual crossroads of textiles and human ecology?
So I'm thinking about like, I have sort of a lot of different entry points into this thought. So part of it is thinking about the sort of the idea of embodied textile and like creating sort of an interpretive center for embodied textile. But also thinking about, oh gosh, can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Let's see, I know we're getting very conceptual here. Oh dear, there's so many questions over here. And I had scrolled on. It has to do with the concept of the broader ecology of humaning, the quote from your website. And how did you come to this conceptual crossroads between textiles and human ecology?
So this is really like, this is so new to me right now because it, going back to the class that I took in the fall with Dr. Erin Manning about this idea of opacity and a poetics of relation, but also a poetics of feeling, and how, in relation, relation is driven by feeling, and that, to be human is to feel, and that to not acknowledge feeling as something that's knowledge producing is also, like what's the word, a symptom of our society as well. And so, I think that my work is so deeply driven by feeling and sort of emoting, and that space of feeling and emoting is where the content comes from, and the new is sort of kind of birthed. And so it's, like I said, it's still new, but it's really about, going this idea of opacity and making opaque the transparent nature of feeling.
Oh, so profound. That I'm going to take with. That's really a lot to ponder and to feel, as you say, so important. I think we need to say goodbye for now, but please, I hope this is the beginning of a long association between our departments, and would love to see you again. Hopefully you can come up to Portland sometime soon.
Indeed, and you have to visit us in Long Beach as well.
Deal. There's lots of love in the chat. I think you helped us all transform today.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. Please feel free to hit me up on Instagram or email. I'd be happy to hear from all of you.
Yeah, I'll put your studio URL in the chat in a sec, but also this is the PSU Textile Arts. If anybody is interested, for next week, we're going to have another speaker, Portland-based Baba Wage Diakite, who's going to talk about his work with the Bogolamfini mudcloth and Kofalin Cultural Center in Mali. So that's at that PSU Textile Arts site. And it's also where you'll find a recording of this talk, which will appear probably in about a week or so. So if you want to share this with other people, I would encourage you to do so at that website. So thank you, Jeanne. Thank you, everybody who was here, participated. It's been a lovely bringing together of minds and hearts.
Thank you, Annin. Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.